So I thought I'd make another test-driven development video, um, and on this one I'm going to try and uh, implement a couple of requirements and show it, I guess, from an outside-in perspective, but also trying to see if I can let the tests really sort of drive the design of the code and the application. Um, as is usual in these situations, I've got a slightly contrived scenario, and that contrived scenario does kind of, I think, lend itself to what I want to do. So already I've got an idea in my head about, where this will go, which is trying to resist the temptation to allow that to dictate the code that gets written, and just relax and just let the tests inform where the code goes. So the requirements I've got for this are that I need to create an API over HTTP, and the reason I've specified that as a requirement is because that forces me to, or I'm intending, the intention there is that it forces me to first think about this from a HTTP perspective, because that's how the requirements have been defined. It's not some abstract thing where we're saying, "Oh, just make a thing, make some code that does this, write me a function that does this." We've got a real world scenario where it's not just a function; it's something that's going to be over HTTP. That's kind of quite often where requirements come from, and we can use that as a starting point. But it doesn't have to dictate the rest of our code. So that's the first thing. Second thing, so this is going to be like a movie ratings kind of API. And the idea is that we're going to basically allow people to vote on different movies. So the first requirement is going to be, given a movie ID, allow votes to be registered for the movie. And I've kind of put there not to worry about repeat votes, so we're not going to have to worry about kind of making sure that the same person doesn't vote twice. The reason for having this idea of allowing people to vote is that it kind of implies that we need to store something. It implies that it's not just a purely, return some data thing. There is something here. Something's going to be persisted somewhere, and it's something that data that we control potentially. So I've put that in there deliberately to try and force us to address that problem. But I also want to kind of use this as to try and not address that problem until we need to address it. So the next requirement is, given a movie ID, retrieve the movie name, the ID, the number of votes, which obviously then links to the previous requirement, and also the rating from the movie database. And I guess the interesting part here is the fact that we're getting the number of votes and the rating from the movie database means that we're getting data from two different places. We're getting data from our own votes from our own kind of users, and we're also getting a rating from an external data store. So we've got to bring two things together to make this happen. And so that it just seemed like kind of a nice problem that just forces us to think about a number of different things. So we've got this idea that it's a HTTP thing. That's kind of explicit straight away. We've got some votes to record, and then we've also got some votes to retrieve, and also a rating from an external from a third-party data store. So that's that, and I guess the first thing to say is that depending on kind of, I guess, how you're kind of coming at this will depend on how much kind of like research you need to do. From my perspective, I I the idea of kind of creating an API over HTTP, I feel pretty comfortable with that. I feel comfortable with the idea of if we're doing it over HTTP, the idea of it being kind of perhaps kind of REST based. That whilst that's not explicit here in my head, that's what I'm already thinking. REST based API, something that has the type of object in the URL schema, and then some sort of probably numeric identifier at the end of that. It's using that that we're using a kind of a get method when we're kind of retrieving data, maybe a post method when we're allowing votes to be submitted. So those things are already kind of flying through my mind. The fact that it's over HTTP, that could still be GraphQL or something like that, and I think those conversations around the details when we say over HTTP, what do we mean? That needs to be a conversation between whoever's building the API and the clients that are going to be using it. Or either, if we're building this from an API first perspective, we need to think about how we expect our clients to access this data. Do we expect it to be over, is a REST based API the best way of doing that? Maybe we're actually responding to a request from a client that we need an API, in which case, how are they currently using it? Maybe GraphQL is going to be the best thing for that. Maybe they're going to be a little bit kind of different. It's going to be using TRPC or something like that. So there are a number of different things there, and that's probably a conversation that needs to happen. And again, we need to work out what assumptions are being made about this. In order to simplify this and allow us to focus on the actual TDD aspect of it, I'm going to sort of make some assertions here and say we're doing this from an API first perspective. We're defining this, and it's going to be REST based, and that's it. The bit about kind of allowing votes to be registered, that seems reasonable to me. I don't feel the need to make any further. I don't think I'm making any further assumptions about that. It's already said about the repeat votes, so it's like, okay. Other than that, I'm assuming that every vote is the same as every other vote, so we're just, a vote is a vote is a vote. The interesting part here is about the movie database. So, if we've got a movie ID, and I would assume for a start off that's perhaps our movie ID. It's a internal representation of a movie, not necessarily the same ID that the movie database use. So I'm already thinking we perhaps need a means to match up the way we identify a movie with the way the movie database identifies a movie. And then I'm thinking I need to know how the movie database API works. So, I'd be wanting to kind of know, how does this... so I've got the developer kind of pages up here for the movie database. I want to know, how do we get details of a movie? How do we get the rating for the movie? And having kind of scanned through this, I can kind of relatively kind of quickly see that coming down here, we've got the ability to get details for a movie. We don't appear to have anything that's specifically for getting ratings. We can add and delete ratings here, but it looks like the ratings we get as part of the details. And over here, we can test out an ID. I've already put in an ID here for Napoleon, which I got from the movie database from the main public site. And so I can test that request out here, and again, it's just a REST-based request that you give it an API key, and then you can make the request, and it gives you back details about the movie, genres, homepage for the movie, title of the movie, all that kind of stuff. And then if we look down at the bottom, we can see we've got this vote average of 6.458. So I'm going to go with that being the data that we want to retrieve. So I'm looking at that and thinking this is fine. We can make, when we come to need to get that data, we're going to be making a HTTP request to get that information and bring it out. Now, the only other thing that I would kind of want to at least have a little bit of a think about for start off is on the we say don't no premature optimization, but I feel like it would be remiss of me as a developer not to at least consider the likely scale of use of our endpoint versus the rate limits or usage rules around around the sort of third party services that we're going to be using. And so one of the things, if we look in, where is it? Under here, we can go and we can look at the rate limits for the movie database. And it says here, as of December 16, 2019, we've disabled the original API rate limiting. And it says we do still have some upper limits to mitigate needlessly high bulk scraping. They sit somewhere in the region of 50 requests per second range. Now, if we publish an API where we don't have any rate limits, then there's nothing to stop a DDoS attack or whatever, or whether intended or not, on our API resulting in a spike in requests to the movie database. If every time we get a request, we're making a request to the movie database. So in order to make sure that we play nicely with this, at some point we should probably consider separating the idea of a request to our API with a request to the movie database, or we should consider the idea of caching the response to a request. So if we make one request in, then we'll make a request to the movie database, get the data back, but then cache it so that subsequent requests don't make the same request over and over again. That would again mitigate the situation there. But even if we do that, if we were to get, let's say we had 50,000 movies in our kind of list, whatever, and all 50,000 were being requested, then the caching is only going to help for repeat requests to the movie database API. It won't help us if we've got 50,000 different requests going at the same time. So that caching approach doesn't fundamentally solve the problem. It reduces the likelihood of the problem happening. It doesn't remove it. The thing that would remove it would be completely separating the idea of the request coming in here with the request going out for the movie database. And what that would mean is there would perhaps be a delay between some of that data wouldn't be always available. It would be the data would eventually be there. It wouldn't necessarily be there sort of straight away, and it wouldn't necessarily be live data from the movie database. It'd be a little bit sort of delayed. But they're the kinds of things that we need to be mindful of. We don't necessarily need to address them all, on day one, but we need to be aware. Not that we need to be aware. We should be aware. There's an element of just being kind of aware that the impact that the things you're doing can have on the other things, and that's the same as even your database or the place where you might be kind of hosting this thing or whatever. Can you when are you likely to hit limits? If you're likely to hit limits on day one, then maybe kind of think about it straight away. If you look at it and think, well, it's unlikely we're going to be kind of hitting limits, but I'm aware that we could hit a limit at some point in the future. Just be aware of that, because that's that can be useful if you realise that there are some decisions you need to make now that may either prohibit you from making good changes in the future, or may make it harder. But that's as much as I would sort of say there. For the moment, I'm just going to assume that when I make a request, I'm going to make a request to the movie data. The first thing I do, the first simplest case, when a request comes in, I'm going to get the data, and I'm then going to also make a request to the movie database to get that rating, and I'm going to bring that data together, and I'm going to return it. That'll be sort of the first, because that feels like the sort of simplest. My assumption is that's what we would do. It feels like the simplest thing, but we can see where we go, and there's other reasons why we might kind of want to do something different. So we might say, the requirements for this API are that it would, let's say we had a requirement here that said, the response time must be less than 50 milliseconds. Let's say we had that. It may well be that if we specified that as a requirement, then we wouldn't be able. Then we literally couldn't just go and get that data from the movie database and return it, because maybe we're not going to be able to do it within that time, or we're not going to be able to guarantee it within that time, because we're going to be dependent on the response time of the movie database, and that may or may not meet our needs. Even if that was a requirement, I would still probably want to do a simpler thing for a start off, and then worry about that requirement later on, because there are different strategies we can use to try and kind of come up with that. We don't need to decide on them now, but for the moment, I'm gonna. In fact, what I'll do, I will keep that in there, and I'll put that as a nice to have. And let's put those as must have. So at least we can maybe consider coming back to that and think, what's the impact? How would we use our testing to drive out changes kind of based on that? And maybe we can do that. But let's see where we go. That hopefully that sort of sets the scene. And suffice to say, then for this application, what I've got set up is I've got an empty kind of spec file here. Got nothing in it yet. My package.json, I've got various sort of things with TypeScript, ESLint, Prettier, Mocha and Chai for testing and what have you. I've got a Cynon in there in case I need to kind of mock anything, which I've hooked up to Chai so that I can do more interesting assertions on it. I've got a super test, which can use to make HTTP-like requests, which some people would sort of say don't use Supertest for this, and I have some sympathy for that, but I think for the purpose of what I'm doing here, it's a reasonable kind of shortcut for getting the tests up and running. That's the setup for this. So the next thing we'll work on will be actually kind of writing a test and getting started.